The first time I laid eyes on Michael was at a college seminar. We were both there for extra credits, though our paths were quite different. He was a business major while I was pursuing literature. I was drawn to him from the moment he raised his hand and posed a challenging question to the professor. After class, we found ourselves at the same coffee shop, and from there, it just seemed like the universe wanted us to be together. We chatted about everything, from college, hobbies, to our childhood memories. "I come from a pretty strict background," he mentioned, taking a sip from his cup. "My parents are deeply religious." I remember shrugging. "So? My parents are free thinkers. They always taught me to question everything." Michael laughed. "Sounds like we're from different planets." But despite our differences, there was an undeniable chemistry. We began to see each other more frequently, studying together and exploring the city during the weekends. About 2 years into our relationship, we decided to move in together. It was a practical decision. Our apartments were far from the university, and sharing a place made sense. Plus, we were inseparable by then. However, when Michael broke the news to his parents, it wasn't received well. At a dinner at their house, Mrs. Davis, Michael's mother, was the first to voice her concerns. "Living together before marriage? Michael, you know how we feel about that." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mom, times have changed. It's not a big deal." Mr. Davis chimed in. "In our house it is. You're living in sin." I could feel the weight of their stares. Wanting to ease the tension, I said, "We respect your beliefs, but this is our decision. We're adults." Mrs. Davis sighed. "It's just not the way we raised you." Michael took my hand. "Lizzie and I love each other. We want to start our life together, and I hope you can support that." The evening ended on a somber note, but Michael and I were firm in our decision. We found a cozy apartment close to campus and moved in. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Our bond grew stronger, but the strain with his parents was always in the background, like an old radio playing a sad tune. One evening, as we were settling into our new life, there was a knock on the door. It was Mrs. Davis, holding a pie. "I thought I'd come by and see how you two are doing," she said, looking around with a critical eye. "We're doing great, Mrs. Davis," I replied, trying to be cordial. She sat down, placing the pie on the table. "This is all temporary, right? You'll get married soon?" Michael cleared his throat. "We haven't decided that yet, Mom." As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the constant pressure from Michael's parents started to weigh on us. Our once carefree dates and movie nights began to have a shadow, the looming expectation of marriage. One evening, while we were making dinner together in our tiny kitchen, Michael broached the subject. "Lizzie, have you ever thought about, having a wedding?" I looked up from chopping the vegetables, surprised. "Like, for us? Are you proposing?" He smiled awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Not exactly. I mean, yes, I want to marry you someday, but right now, it's more about my parents. Maybe if we had a ceremony, they'd back off." I sighed. "So you're saying a wedding without the legal paperwork?" He nodded. "Just a thought. We can invite friends, make it a fun day. My parents get their wedding, and we get some peace." It wasn't the romantic proposal I'd imagined, but I understood his reasoning. "All right," I said slowly. "But on one condition, we do it our way. No big church wedding, just something small and intimate." Michael grinned, relief evident on his face. "Deal." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparations. We chose a beautiful outdoor venue, invited our close friends and family, and planned a simple but heartfelt ceremony. When we broke the news to his parents, their reaction was surprisingly subdued. "An outdoor wedding?" Mrs. Davis asked, raising an eyebrow. "Well, it's unconventional, but if it means you two are taking the next step, I suppose we can support it." Mr. Davis added, "As long as you're committed to each other, that's what matters." The day of the wedding was sunny and bright. I wore a simple white dress, and Michael looked dashing in his suit. Our friends cheered, and even Michael's parents seemed genuinely happy. During the reception, Mrs. Davis pulled me aside. "Lizzie, I want to apologize," she began, her voice soft. "I know we've been hard on you two, But seeing you together today, I realized that love is what truly matters." I smiled, touched by her words. "Thank you, Mrs. Davis. That means a lot." The day ended on a high note, with everyone dancing and celebrating our love. It felt like we had finally won Michael's parents over, and I hoped this would be a fresh start for us. But as days passed, their daily visits began. They'd drop by unannounced, often with unsolicited advice or thinly veiled criticisms. It was as if the wedding had given them a free pass to interfere in our lives. One evening, as Michael and I were unwinding after a long day, there was a knock at the door. Opening it, I found Mrs. Davis holding a casserole dish. "Just thought I'd drop off some dinner," she said, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thanks," I replied, taking the dish. "But you don't have to do this." She waved a hand dismissively. "It's no trouble. I just thought, since you're always so busy, you might not have time to cook." I forced a smile, sensing the underlying judgment. "We manage, but thanks anyway." As the door closed, I sighed deeply. Michael wrapped an arm around me. "It'll be okay," he whispered. It started with the subtle comments, the not-so-innocent questions. "Why is the house so messy?" Or, "Have you considered cooking something more nutritious?" Mrs. Davis would ask, her tone dripping with faux concern. One day, I came home from work, exhausted, to find her in our living room, reorganizing our bookshelves. "Mrs. Davis, what are you doing?" I asked, taken aback. She looked up, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "Just thought I'd help tidy up a bit. These shelves looked so cluttered." Michael entered from the kitchen, holding 2 cups of tea. "Mom's just helping out, Lizzie," he said, trying to play mediator. I took a deep breath, my patience waning. "This is our home, Michael. We didn't ask for help." Mrs. Davis pursed her lips, her eyes watering. "I'm just trying to be helpful. After all, now we're family." Days like these became more frequent. They'd pop by without notice, giving advice we never asked for, criticizing decisions we'd made together as a couple. It was clear they no longer saw boundaries. One evening, after a particularly trying visit from his parents, Michael and I sat down for a heart-to-heart. "Michael, this has to stop," I began, my voice trembling with frustration. "I can't live like this, feeling like I'm constantly being judged in my own home." He ran his fingers through his hair, looking equally stressed. "I know, Lizzie, it's just, they're my parents. I don't know how to tell them to back off without hurting their feelings." I replied, "But what about our feelings, our peace of mind? We can't keep sacrificing that for them." A week later, we invited them over for dinner, deciding to address the issue head-on. The evening started off pleasantly enough. We chatted about work, friends, and the latest news. But as the main course was served, I took a deep breath and dove in. "Mrs. Davis, Mr. Davis, we invited you over because there's something we need to discuss," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. Mr. Davis looked up, his fork pausing mid-air. "What's the matter?" I exchanged a glance with Michael, who nodded in encouragement. "It's about the frequent visits and, well, the constant input on our lives." Mrs. Davis looked taken aback. "We're just trying to help." Michael took over. "Mom, Dad, we appreciate that you care, but it's becoming overwhelming. We need some space to live our lives, make our mistakes, and grow together." Tears formed in Mrs. Davis's eyes. "After all we've done for you, this is how you repay us?" Mr. Davis added, his voice stern. "We're just looking out for you. It seems Lizzie here doesn't appreciate family." I felt a pang of guilt, but stood my ground. It's not about appreciation. It's about respect, respecting our boundaries and our choices. The room grew silent, the tension palpable. Mrs. Davis dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, her shoulders shaking. "We just wanted to be part of your lives. I never thought it'd come to this." Michael looked torn, his loyalty divided, but he held firm. "Mom, we love you, but this is our life. We need you to understand that." The evening ended with Mrs. Davis in tears, Mr. Davis looking disappointed, and an unspoken agreement that things had to change. As they left, I felt a mix of relief and dread, wondering what the future held for our relationships. Days after the confrontation, the house felt unusually quiet. The constant visits had stopped, but the silence was both a relief and a curse. Every time the doorbell rang or there was a knock, my heart would race, expecting it to be Michael's parents. But it never was. One evening, as Michael and I sat on our couch, he broached the topic. "Lizzie, do you think we were too harsh? I mean, they're my parents. Maybe we overreacted?" I took his hand, feeling its warmth. "Michael, it's not about being harsh. It's about setting boundaries. We did what we had to do." He sighed deeply. "I know, it's just hard. I never imagined being in this situation with them." As days turned into weeks, we began to feel the weight of our decision. There were no more surprise visits, but there were also no calls or messages. It was as if we had cut ties completely. During this period, I often found solace in browsing property listings online. One day, as I was scrolling through, a beautiful house in a neighboring town caught my eye. It had a large garden, a spacious living area, and most importantly, it was far away from our current life. "Michael, come look at this," I called out. He joined me, peering at the screen. "Wow, it's beautiful. But why are you looking at houses?" I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. I was thinking, maybe it's time for a fresh start, somewhere new, where we can create our own memories, away from all this drama. He looked surprised. "You mean move? Leave everything behind?" I nodded. "It's drastic, I know, but maybe it's what we need." We discussed it at length, weighing the pros and cons. The idea of starting anew was enticing, but also terrifying. Yet, the more we talked, the more it felt right. A few weeks later, we visited the house. It was even more beautiful in person, and the neighborhood seemed perfect. After much consideration, I decided to use the money I had inherited from my grandmother to buy it. The day we signed the papers, I felt a mix of emotions. Excitement for the new beginning, but also sadness for what we were leaving behind. The move went smoothly, and soon we were settling into our new home. It felt like a dream. The peace and quiet were just what we needed. One evening, as we were enjoying a quiet dinner in our new dining room, Michael said, "Lizzie, I think this was the best decision we ever made." I smiled, feeling content. I think so too. The first few months in our new home were like a dream. The mornings were quiet, filled with the chirping of birds, and the evenings brought a calm, tranquil energy. Michael and I fell into a comfortable routine, enjoying the privacy and peace that our new surroundings provided. The past seemed like a distant memory, and the tension that once surrounded our lives had all but disappeared. Until one fateful day. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when the doorbell rang. Michael went to answer it. I heard murmurs, and then a familiar voice. My heart sank. It was Mrs. Davis. I walked to the entrance, my face revealing my shock. There they were, Mrs. and Mr. Davis, suitcases in tow, standing at our doorstep. "Mom? Dad? What are you doing here?" Michael asked, his voice filled with surprise. Mrs. Davis smiled, a bit too sweetly. "We missed you, dear, and we thought, why not pay a visit?" I tried to keep my composure. "It's unexpected." Mr. Davis chimed in. "We just wanted to see where our son is living now. Is that so wrong?" Michael seemed torn. "Of course not, but a heads up would have been nice." Mrs. Davis looked around, her eyes scanning our home. "Oh, what a lovely place you have here. Much nicer than the old one." I bristled but said nothing. The visit turned into a stay. One night became 2, then 3. They began to settle in, making themselves comfortable, much like they had in our previous home. One evening, after dinner, I pulled Michael aside. "Michael, we can't go down this road again. We moved to escape this." He sighed. "I know, Lizzie, but they're my parents. I can't just throw them out." "Then what? Let them take over our lives again?" Mrs. Davis, who seemed to have overheard our conversation, walked over, her eyes welling up with tears. "Is that how you feel, Michael? That we're a burden?" Michael looked helplessly at me, then back at his mother. "Mom, it's not like that. We just wish you had told us you were coming." She sniffled. We just wanted to be close to our son, but it seems we're not welcome here either. I had a sinking feeling when I heard Michael's parents mention they'd made a decision about their living situation. The two of us had recently been discussing the matter privately, hoping to find a delicate way to address the issue. Now, it seemed the matter was going to be thrust into the open. "Lizzie, Michael," Mr. Davis began, "we have some news." Michael shifted in his seat, already sensing what was coming. "Go on," he prompted. Mrs. Davis, trying to sound cheerful, said, "We've sold our house. We realized there's no need for it when we have such a lovely family home here with you two." My eyes widened in shock. "You did what?" "We wanted to be closer to you both," Mr. Davis explained, looking earnest. Mrs. Davis looked hurt. "We are family. Why wouldn't you want us here?" I took a deep breath and said what I'd wanted to say for a long time. "This house, it's mine. It's not owned jointly by Michael and me. It's in my name only." I retrieved a file from the study, showing them the ownership documents. Mrs. Davis looked at the papers and then back at me, clearly stunned. "But you're married. What's yours is Michael's and vice versa." I smiled triumphantly. "That's where you're mistaken. We held a wedding ceremony, yes, but Michael and I never legally married. We never signed any official documents, so, technically, you're not my in-laws." The weight of my words seemed to hang in the air. Mrs. Davis's face turned a shade paler, her eyes widening in disbelief. Mr. Davis looked from me to Michael, seeking some form of denial. Michael took my hand, signaling his support. "It's true, Mom and Dad. We thought you'd be more accepting if we had a ceremony, but we never felt the need to get the state involved in our relationship." Mrs. Davis began to sob. "So, you deceived us? And now you're throwing us out?" The room was heavy with tension after the bombshells were dropped. Michael's parents were clearly taken aback, but it wasn't long before the shock turned into outrage. "So, you tricked everyone with a sham wedding? And you think that makes everything all right?" Mrs. Davis's voice had a hint of venom. Michael sighed. "It wasn't about tricking anyone. It was about the way we wanted to live our lives. The ceremony was for us, and those who wanted to celebrate our love." Mrs. Davis's face turned a shade redder. "You dare defy the sanctity of marriage, live together in sin, and then mock us with a fake wedding." "I've had enough," Mr. Davis declared, standing up suddenly. "You, young lady, are nothing but a sinner and a witch, trying to pull my son away from his family, his values." I was taken aback by the fierceness of their reaction, but I wouldn't let them intimidate me. "I have not taken Michael from anyone. He's made his own choices, and it's high time you respect them." Mrs. Davis's eyes were filled with tears, but her voice was stern. "Michael, come home with us. Leave this woman. She's done nothing but pull you into her web of deceit." Michael, ever the calm in the storm, replied, "Mom, Dad, I love you both, but my place is here, with her. She's been nothing but kind and understanding, even when you both haven't been. You can't just demand I leave her." "You're choosing her over us?" Mr. Davis's voice was a mix of anger and disbelief. "I'm choosing to live my life on my terms," Michael asserted. The room went silent for what felt like an eternity. The air was thick, every breath heavy. Mrs. Davis's face was a mask of hurt and betrayal. "Very well," she said, her voice cold. "But remember this, you're turning your back on your family, on your faith, all for her." "I'm not turning my back on anyone," Michael said. "I just wish you'd see that." Mrs. Davis's eyes were hard, her voice bitter. "Let's go," she said to her husband, not giving either of us another glance. And with that, they left, leaving behind a wake of hurt, confusion, and uncertainty. I looked at Michael, his face a mirror of my own feelings. We both knew that things had changed irrevocably, and there was no going back. A few days after the confrontation, as I was heading back from work, my neighbor, Mrs. Carlson, called out to me. She was an older lady, known for her daily walks and her uncanny ability to know everyone's business. "Did you hear about the Davis family not selling their house?" she asked with a knowing look. I paused, taken aback. "What do you mean?" She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "They never put their house on the market. I heard from Susan, who heard from Janice, who works at the town's real estate office. There's no record of the Davis property being up for sale. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Were they lying to us all this time? When I got home, I shared the information with Michael. He looked shocked. I can't believe they'd lie to us. What were they trying to achieve? We both knew the answer. They wanted to manipulate the situation to their advantage. The realization was a hard pill to swallow. All this time, while we tried to understand and accommodate them, they had been playing a game. Michael sighed deeply, rubbing his temples. This changes things. It's one thing to have disagreements, but outright deception? That's something else entirely. We can't keep letting them pull us into their manipulative games, I said firmly. We need boundaries, strong ones. Michael nodded. You're right. We can't continue like this. It's unhealthy for us and for our relationship. The next day, he went over to his parents' house. He needed to confront them, get some answers. When he returned, his face was a mix of anger and sadness. They admitted it, he began, his voice heavy. They thought that if they moved in with us, we'd be a proper family again. They felt threatened by our independence. We sat down, discussing our next steps. It was clear that for our own sanity and the health of our relationship, we needed distance from them. We need a break, Michael declared. Some time away from all this drama and manipulation. I agreed. It's the best decision for us right now. That evening, we sent a message to his parents, informing them of our decision. The reply was filled with anger and accusations, but we remained firm. We needed this, for ourselves and for our future. The next few weeks were quiet. We focused on each other, rebuilding the trust and closeness that had been strained over the past months. One evening, as we sat on our porch, looking at the stars, Michael turned to me. "Thank you," he whispered, "for standing by me, for fighting for us." I smiled, squeezing his hand. Always. The journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but it was a poignant reminder of the importance of boundaries, honesty, and mutual respect in any relationship. As the night deepened, we looked towards the future, hoping for peace and understanding.